Before Europe ever uttered the word America, the other side of the world was already home to millions. They had cities, armies, temples, and roads. But a single mistake, the error of one man, forever altered their destiny. In this video, we'll explore how Columbus wasn't actually searching for America and never knew he had found it. Why was his expedition called insane, and who was daring enough to grant him ships? What did he see when he first stepped onto the shore of a new continent? How did his voyage trigger wars, epidemics, and the disappearance of entire civilizations? This story isn't just about geography. It's a tale of how greed, faith, and curiosity can redraw the world map and reshape the fates of millions. Suggest new topics for our next videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Stories for Sleep are here every day. Get comfortable. Let's begin.
Seas not on any map. By the end of the 14th century, Europe stood on the threshold of a new era. In Spain, the Reconquista had ended. The last Moorish stronghold, Granada, had surrendered. The Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, had finally united the country, replenished the treasury, and began to think about the future. That same year, a man reappeared at the Spanish court who had spent years trying to convince the monarchs of one single idea. The route to India could be found by sailing west. His name was Christopher Columbus. Born in Genoa to a simple weaver's family, he went to sea in his youth, worked as a merchant, studied maps, and drew his own navigational charts. He had no university education, but possessed rare persistence. His idea was fundamentally built on an error. He severely underestimated the Earth's size and didn't know an entire continent lay between Europe and Asia. But he believed that if one set sail from Spain and held a course due west, one could reach the shores of Asia. At first, he was ridiculed. His ideas were rejected in Portugal. In England and France, they wouldn't even listen to him. Only in Spain did he find support. A monk named Juan Perez played a key role, persuading Queen Isabella to give Columbus another chance. She agreed. A contract was signed. Columbus received the title of admiral, the right to govern future lands, and a share of all the wealth he would find. Preparation began in May. 3 small ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña, stood in the port of Palos de la Frontera. They were modest in size, with little protection, not designed for a long ocean journey. Crew recruitment was difficult. People were afraid. Rumors spread of emptiness beyond the horizon, a cliff edge, monsters, magnets that would pull nails from planks. Eventually, a crew was assembled. Most not out of a calling. Some went to avoid prison. Others were promised pardons or money. The sailors didn't know exactly where they were going. They were told, to India, but the map they followed was merely a guess. No one had crossed this route before them. On the morning of August 3, 1492, the fleet set sail. The farewell was brief. No salutes, no songs. No one believed they would return. First, their course took them to the Canary Islands. There they resupplied and repaired the Pinta. Its rudder had broken even before leaving Spain. Then they ventured into the open ocean. This was the part of the journey no one knew. With each week, the horizon remained empty. The wind didn't change. The sun beat down hotly. People grew nervous. Many began marking days on the walls. Some begged to turn back. Columbus kept a log, but recorded underestimated distances so the crew would think they weren't too far from home. Every night they scanned the sky. There were no signs the course was right. No familiar shore, no oncoming ship. Sometimes birds landed on the water. Sometimes seaweed floated up. Columbus said, "It's a sign land is near," but land did not appear. One day, strange lightning flashed in the sky. In the evening, the compass began to behave oddly. The needle deviated. Some thought they were lost, that the world beyond was beginning to disintegrate. One sailor said perhaps the ocean was endless. Columbus was silent, but inside, he too doubted. After a month, unrest became obvious. The sailors began talking of mutiny. People were tired. They didn't understand where they were. They had no map, only the captain's faith and the silence of the ocean. Columbus promised that if they didn't sight land in a few days, they would turn back. And yet, on October 10th, birds began circling the ships more frequently. On the morning of October 11th, branches and bits of wood appeared on the water, and that night, around 2 a.m., the cry came from the watch, "Land." They didn't know what they had found, didn't know it wasn't Asia at all, but for them, it was the journey's end. They had crossed seas not on any map, and now stood before a shore that would forever change the course of history.
Land. And then what? On the morning of October 12th, as the sun slowly rose over the horizon, Columbus's 3 ships approached the shore of an unknown land. The lookout, Rodrigo de Triana, was the first to see a shadow on the water, then made out the silhouettes of trees. Columbus ordered the boats lowered. He was in full-dress uniform, with the flag of Castile, a letter from the Queen, and thoughts that he had reached Asia. They landed on one of the Bahamian islands, the name given by the local people, which Columbus recorded as Guanahani. He didn't understand their language, but this didn't bother him. He was sure this was one of the islands off the coast of India. Later, he would write in his diary that the island was inhabited by people who were kind, gentle, without weapons, and easily subdued. That first day, Columbus raised the flag of Spain, declaring these lands the property of the Catholic monarchs. He didn't ask the local people whose land they considered it to be. He believed he had arrived in lands he was destined to discover and bring under his rule. The natives came to the shore. They had no metal, no clothing in the usual sense. They offered gifts, feathers, beads, food. They didn't understand who these white-skinned people with iron things were, and they certainly didn't know that with their appearance, everything would change. Columbus took their gesture as a sign of recognition of his authority. He decided they were Indians because he thought he was in India. This name would stay with them forever, despite the geographical error. In the following days, the fleet moved from island to island. They were searching for gold. Columbus was interested not in the climate, culture, or customs, but in where the mines were, where jewels were mined, which peoples wore ornaments. He asked questions, pointed at objects, gestured. They answered, but he understood them loosely. On one of the islands, he met people who had small gold pendants. They explained that farther south was a land where there was even more gold. Columbus remembered this. He wrote, "If these people know gold, it means there is plenty here. If they don't resist, it means they can be converted to Christianity and used for labor." His first impression of the local people was ambiguous. On one hand, he wrote they were hospitable, open, unarmed. On the other, that they could easily be made into servants and taught Spanish. He saw them not as allies, but as a resource. Meanwhile, the crew was getting acquainted with the new shores. They tasted local fruits for the first time, encountered plants they didn't know. There was tobacco, there was potato, there were parrots, palm trees, and a heat they weren't used to. Many were amazed and simultaneously felt fear. The land was beautiful, but incomprehensible. Columbus wrote that there were no dangerous animals, no cities, no army. He was wrong. He simply hadn't reached the places where powerful societies lived. He was on the periphery of the continent, but thought he had reached its heart. He wrote that everything was under control, that the natives recognized his authority, that the mission was nearing success. In reality, he understood neither the language, nor the political structure, nor the beliefs of the local peoples. He didn't know this was only the first step. Didn't know that beyond lay the islands of the Caribbean Sea and then a mainland with a millennia-old history. He didn't know this world was far more complex than it seemed from the shore. The ships sailed on. In November, they reached Cuba. He was sure it was the mainland. He sent a group inland to find palaces and temples. They found neither, but brought back tales of an amazing plant the locals smoked. Its leaves were dried, rolled into tubes, and lit. This is how Europe first learned of tobacco. Then came Hispaniola, the island now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There Columbus decided to build the first settlement. Before his eyes, the Santa Maria ran aground and was wrecked. From its wreckage, they built a fort. Several dozen men were left behind, the first European colony in America. Columbus returned to Spain with the others. He brought with him a little gold, exotic items, several captured natives, and most importantly, news.
He believed he had reached India, that the route was open, that trade could now be established. In letters he wrote of wonderful lands, kind people, and a great mission. He didn't know that with his first steps, he had laid the foundation for a long chain of invasions. He didn't know that after the first gifts would come cannons, and after the missionaries, soldiers. He didn't know that these islands, it was not a discovery, but the beginning of the end.
Illusi and gold. Returning to Spain in the spring of 1493, Columbus found himself at the center of attention. He was greeted as the man who had opened a new route to India, though in essence he still didn't understand where he had been. His ship docked at ports with cages holding dark-skinned people with feathers in their hair. In the holds were baskets of corn, cotton, shiny pebbles, unusual fruits, bright parrots, but most attention was drawn to the pendants of gold, even though there were few. The royal court received him with honors. He was called the Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and his stories were met with admiration. He reported discovering many islands, rich in nature and suitable for conversion to Christianity. He assured them there was incomparably more gold in these lands than he had managed to bring. He swore that if given more ships and people, he would open up inexhaustible riches. Isabella and Ferdinand believed him. His promises aligned with their hopes for power, money, and glory. It was all within reach. He was permitted to organize a second expedition, but now everything was different. The first time he sailed with 3 modest ships, the second time with a fleet of 17 vessels and over 1,000 people on board. Among them were not explorers, but craftsmen, soldiers, officials, and priests. This was no longer an expedition, but a colonization. They set off in the autumn of 1493. They soon arrived at Hispaniola, where the garrison had been left. But the fort built from the Santa Maria's wreckage lay in ruins. Those who had stayed were dead. The exact reasons are unknown. Perhaps a quarrel with the locals, perhaps internal strife. Columbus decided to start anew. He founded a new settlement, La Navidad, then another, Isabela. He tried to establish an administration, impose control, and organize gold mining, but there was little gold. What the locals wore as jewelry had no relation to real deposits. He sent detachments inland, gathered information, but there were no major finds. Nevertheless, he continued to believe, or pretend to believe, in mountains of gold. He used force. He imposed quotas for gold collection, demanding the locals bring him a certain amount of gold dust, punishment for failure. The first chains appeared, the first hangings, the first rebellions. Meanwhile, in Spain, they waited results. They waited gold, ships full of riches. Instead, news came of troubles, poor governance, and cruelties. Complaints began. Dissatisfaction grew among the settlers. Food was scarce, diseases spread, discipline broke down. Columbus was failing. He was a sailor, not an administrator. He didn't know how to manage a colony, resolve conflicts, or build stable relations with the locals. He believed finding gold would solve all problems. He was wrong. He journeyed farther, exploring new islands. He reached Jamaica and part of Cuba. Everywhere he looked for signs of India, spices, fragrant aromas.
He asked the locals if they had a king, if they had elephants, if they had peppers. They didn't understand what he wanted, and he didn't understand that he was facing a completely different world. Despite the chaos, in 1496 he returned to Spain again, this time without triumph. Rumors of cruelty, reprisals, and failures followed him. He was still received, but now with restraint. His authority began to crack, but he pleaded, "Give me one more chance." He promised again to find what was not there. A third expedition 2 years later brought him to the shores of South America, the mouth of the Orinoco River. There, for the first time, Columbus began to suspect he might not be in Asia. The river was too mighty, the plants too unfamiliar, the people too different. He wrote in letters, "I feel this land is part of paradise." But publicly, he did not abandon his theory. He couldn't admit his mistake. On Hispaniola, meanwhile, a crisis was brewing. The Spaniards demanded power. The locals rebelled. Complaints went straight to Madrid. In 1500, the monarchs sent an official with a special mission to arrest Columbus and bring him to Spain. He was shackled. So ended his rule over the colony. He was freed, but never regained real support. In 1502, he set out to sea one last time. It was his final expedition. He reached the shores of Central America, searched for a passage to the Indian Ocean, vainly hoping to prove his theory correct. He found no passage, no gold, founded no cities. His ships were damaged by storms. He spent months in isolation, awaiting help. In 1504, he returned to Spain. Old, sick, deceived by his own illusions. He begged for the return of his promised titles and shares, but Queen Isabella had died, and Ferdinand no longer listened. Columbus died 2 years later, never knowing he had opened not a new route to Asia, but an entire continent. His life became a symbol of the dual nature of a new era's beginning. He sought spices and palaces, but found wild shores. He promised gold, but brought violence. He thought he held the map, but found himself on a foreign land without a compass. And yet his journey became the starting point. Ahead lay conquistadors, diseases, ships, wars, treaties, colonies. But the first to step onto this stage was a man who sought one thing, found another, and never understood what he had truly discovered.
Consequences no one had considered. The discovery of America didn't just become a new line in navigational logs. It triggered a chain reaction no one had predicted. What began as a search for a route to India turned into a complete restructuring of the world. Geography changed its outline. Maps were rewritten. But most importantly, the very logic of history changed. After Columbus's return, a race began. Following the Spaniards, the Portuguese, English, and French rushed to the New World, some with royal decrees, others with personal greed. Some wanted gold, others land, others souls. Everyone wanted something for themselves, and everyone believed they had the right to it. Spain quickly divided the world in half. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed. According to it, everything west of an imaginary line went to Spain, everything east to Portugal. No one asked the local inhabitants.
They did not participate in the negotiations. Their existence was accounted for as part of the natural landscape, like forests, rivers, and ore. Settlements began to grow on the Caribbean islands. Each new governor promised more income. Gold became the goal, the meaning, the measure. Where it wasn't found, people were forced to work. Where it was found, they were killed for refusing to share. Local communities were destroyed. Some fled, others fought, others surrendered. But none of these strategies saved them. After Columbus came others. Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico in 1519. He had just over 600 soldiers. The Aztecs had an army, a capital, rituals, walls, temples, and yet Tenochtitlan fell. Why? Because the Spaniards were cruel? Yes. Because they had weapons? That too. But mainly because with them came something no one expected: viruses, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, diseases unknown in the New World. The Indians had no immunity. One infected person and thousands died. Sometimes whole villages vanished within weeks. This wasn't a war in the usual sense. It was an epidemic hidden in fabrics and breath. According to historians' estimates, by the mid-15th century, the indigenous population of the Caribbean islands had declined by 90%. While this was happening, ships laden with trophies sailed to Europe. Ingots, fabrics, exotic fruits, shells, tobacco, Indians in chains. The Old World greedily absorbed everything new. Oranges and corn became commonplace. Potatoes entered the diet of the poor, and with it came the belief that at the edge of the world lay an inexhaustible resource. Spain became the first global empire. Gold from America filled its treasury, but with it came conflicts, corruption, religious intolerance. Churches were built on conquered lands, but so were labor camps. Forced Christianization began. Those who refused baptism became slaves. The encomienda system allowed Spaniards to protect the locals while gaining the right to their labor. It was, in fact, a form of slavery. Soon there weren't enough Indians. Then the next stage began, the importation of Africans. Slaves were brought across the Atlantic, sending back sugar, tobacco, and gold. Thus formed the Triangle of Death: Europe, Africa, America. But even those who didn't participate directly in the conquests felt the changes. In England, they built a fleet. In France, they founded trading companies. New markets, new spices, new diseases, new beliefs emerged. The world economy began to form not in theory, but on decks. And what of America? Languages disappeared. Temples crumbled. Manuscripts burned. Where cities had recently stood, there were now pastures. People who had lived by their own laws for centuries suddenly became subjects of a foreign king. Their gods were forbidden, their bodies not their own. The conquistadors who came after Columbus no longer portrayed themselves as explorers. They came as conquerors. They had manifestos, papal bulls, charters. They invoked God, but acted in the name of gold. Everyone strove to become a new Columbus, not in geography, but in profit. In Europe, his name became a symbol of victory. In America, a symbol of the end. The discovery became not a door to a new era, but a punch in the jaw to those who already lived on this land. And it all started with a map that didn't exist, with the idea that India was closer than it seemed, with the illusion that the earth was just a globe with edges. But it turned out the earth was living people, and the discovery of their lands was not a neutral act, but an invasion. Columbus didn't know what he had started, but his step was the first in a sequence of events from which there is still no washing clean. Because history isn't only what is written in diaries, it is also what was burned, erased, forgotten. And in the case of America, it is millions of voices that no one will ever hear again. Memory and myth. With each decade after the first landing on Guanahani, the significance of Columbus's name became more symbolic. His real life, with all his failures, pleas, exiles, and losses, was gradually replaced by the image of a hero who discovered the New World. His journey was presented as a moment of triumph for the European spirit, courage, and faith. But was it so? Columbus died in poverty and oblivion. His titles were stripped, his income reduced. His sons sued the crown for years, demanding what was promised. Himself never knew he had discovered a new continent. Until the end of his life, he insisted he had found the route to East Asia. But what he didn't understand in life became the basis of a historical myth. After his death, in the 16th and 17th centuries, as Europe formed its worldview, the figure of Columbus proved convenient. One man, one voyage, one date. It looked clear, visual, impressive. The discovery of a continent was reduced to one name. The complex reality, in which millions already lived in America, didn't fit the convenient scheme. There was no room for the Maya, the Inca, the Cherokee, the Mohawk. Their history was too unsettling, too contradictory. It was easier to omit it and elevate the figure of Columbus. In 19th century American schools, Columbus was taught as a founder. Cities, states, and universities were named in his honor. In 1792, 300 years after his first voyage, the first monuments to him were erected in the U.S. In the 20th century, Columbus Day became an official holiday. That he didn't discover an empty land but entered it without permission was not discussed. But time passed, and by the beginning of the 21st century, the myth began to crack. Historians asked, why do we say discovered if millions lived here before? Why celebrate the date that began the destruction of entire peoples? Why ignore the consequences, calling this event exclusively great? In Latin America, Columbus Day was renamed in some countries to Day of Indigenous Resistance. Somewhere it was cancelled altogether. Some were replaced with Day of Cultural Diversity. People began to revise their views. Monuments became subjects of dispute. Some saw them as memory, others as symbols of